I built that house with my own hands, brick by brick, board by board. No contractors, no luxury, just sweat, calluses, and faith. The foundation was laid during the scorching summer of '95, when I was still young enough to believe that hard work alone could secure a man's future. I remember the blisters on my palms, the ache in my lower back after 12-hour days, the way my wife Maria would bring me cold lemonade as the sun set behind the half-finished walls. Those walls witnessed everything. My children's first steps across the rough concrete floors, birthday parties where we hung streamers from the exposed beams, Christmas mornings when wrapping paper littered the living room I had painted 3 times until I got the color just right. Every nail I hammered, every pipe I connected, every tile I laid with meticulous care, it all carried the weight of love, of providing, of creating something permanent for the people who mattered most. But time has a way of eroding even the strongest foundations. As the years passed, I watched my children grow from toddlers who marveled at Daddy's handiwork into teenagers who saw only outdated fixtures and old-fashioned design choices. They wanted modern amenities, sleek finishes, open floor plans that bore no resemblance to the cozy compartments I had carefully crafted. And I, wanting nothing more than their happiness, began to step aside. First, it was just letting them redecorate their rooms. Then it was agreeing to knock down a wall here, install new flooring there. Before I knew it, my modest family home was transforming into something I barely recognized. The warm oak cabinets I had sanded and stained by hand were replaced with sterile white ones. The comfortable floral wallpaper that Maria had chosen for the dining room was torn down in favor of stark, minimalist paint. Room by room, my house was becoming theirs. I told myself this was natural. This was what good fathers did. They adapted, they compromised, they made space for the next generation. When my eldest son Marcus graduated from college and moved back home, I didn't question it. When my daughter Isabella brought her boyfriend to live with us temporarily, I smiled and cleared out my study to make room for them. When my youngest, Carlos, decided to turn the basement into his personal recording studio, I helped him move my workshop to the garage without complaint. Gradually, I found myself occupying less and less space in the house I had built. My favorite armchair was relegated to the corner because it clashed with the new sectional sofa. My books were boxed up and stored in the attic to make room for Isabella's art supplies. The kitchen table where I used to read the morning paper became a laptop station for Carlos's online classes. I was becoming a guest in my own home, tiptoeing around lives that seemed to have no room for the man who had made them possible. But I endured it all with quiet dignity, convincing myself that this was the price of love, the tax of parenthood. I watched my children invite friends over without asking, make major household decisions without consulting me, and treat my opinions as outdated suggestions rather than the wishes of the homeowner. Still, I said nothing. I swallowed my pride and told myself that seeing them happy was worth any personal discomfort. The breaking point came on a cold July morning, winter in our hemisphere, when the frost painted the windows I had installed 25 years earlier. I was in the kitchen making my usual breakfast of coffee and toast when all 3 of my children filed in with expressions I had never seen before. There was something rehearsed about their movements, something calculated in the way they positioned themselves around the small table. Marcus, always the appointed spokesperson, cleared his throat and looked directly at me with eyes that seemed to belong to a stranger. "Dad," he said, his voice carrying a coldness that made my coffee taste bitter. "We need to talk." I set down my cup, my hands suddenly unsteady. "Of course, son, what's on your mind?" Isabella shifted uncomfortably in her chair, unable to meet my gaze. Carlos stared at his phone, as if the screen contained more important information than this conversation. It was Marcus who delivered the blow that would change everything. "We've been talking, and we think it would be best if you moved out." The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire I hadn't seen coming. I blinked, certain I had misheard. "I'm sorry, what?" "You need to leave, Dad." Isabella finally spoke up, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's not working anymore, having you here. We're adults now, and we need our space." Carlos finally looked up from his phone, his young face trying to project an authority he hadn't earned. "We can handle the mortgage payments and everything. You don't need to worry about that." I felt the world tilt beneath my feet. These were my children. The babies I had held in my arms, the toddlers I had taught to ride bicycles, the teenagers whose heartbreaks I had soothed with ice cream and patient listening, and now they were telling me, with the casual efficiency of a business transaction, that I was no longer wanted in the house I had built with my own hands. "But this is my home," I said, hating how small my voice sounded. "I built this place for our family. Dad, please don't make this harder than it needs to be," Marcus replied, his tone suggesting that my emotional response was an inconvenience. "We're not kicking you out, we're just restructuring. You could get a nice apartment, maybe closer to your work. Think of it as a new chapter." A new chapter, as if 30 years of my life could be summarized and filed away so neatly. As if the sweat equity I had invested in every square inch of that house could be dismissed with corporate jargon and false optimism. "Where exactly am I supposed to go?" I asked, the question scraping against my throat like sandpaper. "We've looked into some options," Isabella said, pulling out her phone as if she had been preparing for this moment. "There are some nice senior communities about 20 minutes from here. Or you could rent something small, just until you figure things out." Senior communities. The words hit me like a physical blow. I was 62 years old, not ancient, not infirm, not ready to be warehoused with other discarded parents who had outlived their usefulness. I was a man who still worked full-time, who still climbed ladders and fixed leaky faucets, who still had dreams and plans and a future that extended beyond the rocking chair they seemed to have mentally assigned me. "I don't understand," I said, my voice cracking despite my efforts to remain composed. "What did I do wrong? Why are you doing this?" The silence that followed was deafening. My children exchanged glances, as if they had anticipated this question and prepared a response. It was Carlos who finally spoke, his words delivered with the cruelty that only children can inflict on their parents. "Dad, you're just in the way, all the time. You complain about the music, you don't like our friends, you make everyone uncomfortable. It's like living with a disapproving stranger." Each word was a knife twist. I thought of all the times I had bitten my tongue when their music was too loud, all the occasions I had smiled politely at friends who treated my home like a hotel, all the moments I had retreated to my bedroom to avoid confrontation. Had my attempts to be accommodating been interpreted as disapproval? Had my quiet suffering been seen as passive aggression? "I never said anything about your friends," I protested weakly. "I've tried to stay out of your way." "That's just it, Dad," Marcus said, his voice taking on the patronizing tone he might use with a difficult client. "You shouldn't have to stay out of the way in your own home, and we shouldn't have to walk on eggshells around you. This arrangement isn't working for anyone." But it was working for me. Yes, I had made compromises, and yes, I had given up more space than I had initially intended. But I was still living in the house I had built, still surrounded by the memories I had created, still connected to the life I had worked so hard to establish. The arrangement was working perfectly for me. It was just inconvenient for them. "Give me some time to think about this," I said, grasping for any delay, any reprieve from the verdict they had already delivered. "We've given you time, Dad," Isabella said, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. "We've been planning this for months. We already talked to a lawyer about the best way to handle the transition." A lawyer. They had consulted a lawyer about evicting their own father. The betrayal was so complete, so thoroughly planned, that I felt physically ill. My own children had been plotting against me for months, meeting in secret, discussing my future as if I were a problem to be solved, rather than a person to be respected. "I need to be alone," I said, standing on legs that felt like they might give way at any moment. "I need to think." "Of course, Dad," Marcus said, his tone now artificially gentle, as if he were speaking to a child who had just been told that Santa Claus wasn't real. "Take all the time you need. We're not trying to rush you." But they were rushing me. The lawyer consultations, the researched housing options, the coordinated intervention, everything about their approach suggested that my departure was not a request, but a foregone conclusion. They had already decided my fate. They were simply going through the motions of pretending I had a choice. I walked to my bedroom in a daze, closing the door behind me, and sitting on the bed that had been mine for 25 years. The room felt smaller somehow, as if the walls were already closing in on the life I had built. I looked around at the familiar objects, the dresser I had assembled myself, The reading lamp that had illuminated thousands of evening pages, the framed photos of family vacations and graduations and christenings. How had it come to this? How had I, the man who had sacrificed everything for his family, become the obstacle to their happiness? When had love become such a burden that it required legal intervention to resolve? I picked up one of the photos, a picture of all of us at Carlos's high school graduation, our arms around each other, our faces beaming with pride and joy. We looked like a family then, united in celebration, connected by bonds that seemed unbreakable. But apparently I had been mistaken about the strength of those bonds. The house creaked around me. The familiar sounds that had once been comforting now seemed ominous. Even the building itself seemed to be conspiring against me, groaning its disapproval of my continued presence. I had poured my heart into these walls, and now they were becoming my prison. That night I barely slept. I lay in bed listening to the sounds of my children going about their evening routines, the television in the living room, the shower running in the main bathroom, the muffled conversations that probably concerned my impending departure. They seemed to be carrying on with their lives as if nothing had changed, as if the conversation that had shattered my world had been nothing more than a minor household discussion. Over the next few days, I found myself studying my children's faces for any sign of regret, any indication that they might reconsider their decision. But there was nothing. They were polite but distant, treating me with the kind of careful courtesy usually reserved for house guests who had overstayed their welcome. They would smile when they saw me, ask about my day, and then retreat to their rooms or their friends or their activities, leaving me alone with my confusion and heartbreak. I tried to engage them in conversation, to understand what had prompted this sudden change in our family dynamics, but every attempt was met with vague responses and redirected topics. They had made their decision, and they were not interested in revisiting it. The house that had once been filled with laughter and warmth now felt cold and unwelcoming. I found myself walking through rooms that no longer felt like mine, touching objects that seemed to reject my caress. The kitchen where I had taught Isabella to make pancakes, the living room where I had helped Carlos with his homework, the backyard where I had played catch with Marcus. All of it felt like a museum of memories that I was no longer allowed to visit. But perhaps the most painful part was the realization that my children genuinely believed they were doing the right thing. They weren't acting out of malice or cruelty. They were simply prioritizing their own comfort and convenience over my emotional well-being. In their minds, I was an aging obstacle to their independence, a relic of their childhood that needed to be respectfully but firmly removed. After a week of this emotional torture, I finally accepted the inevitable. I would have to leave the house I had built, the home I had created, the life I had constructed with my own hands. My children had spoken, and despite my heartbreak, I loved them too much to force them to live with a father they clearly found burdensome. So I packed my belongings into a few cardboard boxes and a battered suitcase, taking only the essentials and a handful of photographs. I left behind the tools that had built the house, the furniture that had filled it, the dreams that had sustained me through years of hard work and sacrifice. I left behind everything that had made me who I was, and I walked away from the house that would forever be mine, even if I was no longer welcome in it. The last thing I saw as I pulled away was Carlos in the window, watching me leave with an expression I couldn't read. I raised my hand in a small wave, hoping he might return the gesture, but he just stepped back into the shadows, and I drove away from the only home I had ever truly known. My cousin Roberto lived in a modest house about 15 minutes from my former home, and when I called him in desperation, he didn't hesitate to offer me his backyard guest house. It was a small structure, originally built as a workshop, but converted years ago into a basic living space with a Murphy bed, a tiny kitchenette, and a bathroom so small I had to exit to change my mind. "It's not much," Roberto said apologetically as he showed me around the cramped space, "but you're welcome to stay as long as you need." I thanked him with tears in my eyes, grateful for the kindness that my own children had been unable to show. The guest house was indeed small, perhaps 300 square feet total, but it was shelter, and more importantly, it was offered with genuine warmth and concern for my well-being. The first night in that tiny room was the longest of my life. I lay on the narrow bed, staring at a ceiling that seemed to press down on my chest, and wondered how I had fallen so far so fast. 3 weeks ago, I had been a homeowner, a patriarch, a man with a place in the world. Now I was a charity case, dependent on the kindness of relatives and sleeping in a space smaller than my former walk-in closet. But the physical discomfort was nothing compared to the emotional devastation. Every morning I would wake up disoriented, momentarily forgetting where I was, reaching for the familiar bedside table that was no longer there. The silence was deafening. No sounds of family life, no teenage laughter, no familiar voices calling my name. Just the hum of Roberto's air conditioner and the distant traffic from the main road. I tried to establish routines, to create some sense of normalcy in this alien environment. I would make coffee in the tiny kitchenette, read the newspaper in the single chair that faced the small window, and take walks around Roberto's neighborhood to kill time. But every routine felt hollow, like playing house in a child's playhouse while the real world continued without me. The hardest part was driving past my former home on the way to work. I couldn't help myself. I would slow down as I passed, hoping to catch a glimpse of my children, to see how they were managing without me. What I saw instead was a house that was thriving in my absence. The lawn was still being mowed, the bills were apparently being paid, and life was going on exactly as my children had promised it would. I watched from my car as they hosted barbecues in the backyard I had landscaped, as they invited friends over for parties in the living room I had painted, as they lived their lives in the space I had created, without any apparent awareness of what they had lost. Or perhaps they were simply relieved to be free of the burden I had apparently become. The isolation was crushing. I had always been a social person, someone who derived energy from family interactions and community connections. But now I found myself awkwardly explaining to neighbors and co-workers why I was suddenly living in a guest house, why my address had changed, why I looked tired and distracted all the time. I'm just trying something new, I would say, or the kids needed more space, or it's temporary while I figure some things out. Each explanation felt like a small betrayal of the truth, but the real story was too humiliating to share. How do you tell people that your own children had evicted you from the house you built? How do you explain that love and sacrifice had somehow transformed into inconvenience and resentment? My work suffered. I was a project manager for a construction company, a job that required attention to detail and decisive leadership. But I found myself distracted during meetings, staring out windows, losing track of conversations. My boss, the understanding man named Jim, pulled me aside after a particularly unfocused presentation. "Everything okay at home, Alfred?" he asked, his concern genuine. "You seem off lately." I wanted to tell him everything, to unburden myself to someone who might understand the injustice of my situation. But instead, I just nodded and mumbled something about adjusting to some family changes. Jim looked skeptical but didn't press the issue, and I returned to my office to stare at blueprints that reminded me of all the dreams I had built and lost. The weekends were the worst. I would sit in Roberto's backyard, watching him tend to his garden or work on his car, and I would think about all the projects I had abandoned in my former home. The leaky faucet in the guest bathroom that I had been meaning to fix, the loose floorboard in the hallway that squeaked when you stepped on it, the weather stripping around the front door that needed replacement before the next winter. Did my children even know about these maintenance issues? Would they remember to service the heating system before the cold weather hit? Would they think to clean the gutters, to check the smoke detector batteries, to winterize the outdoor plumbing? I had been the keeper of all these details, the guardian of the house's health and safety, and now I was gone. I found myself checking my phone constantly, hoping for messages from my children. Perhaps they would ask for advice about household repairs, or invite me for Sunday dinner, or simply acknowledge that they missed having me around. But the messages never came. My phone remained silent, an electronic monument to my irrelevance. 3 months into my exile, I decided to drive by the house again. It was a Saturday afternoon, and I told myself I was just running errands in the neighborhood. But as I approached the familiar street, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There was a "for sale" sign in the front yard. I pulled over and sat in my car, staring at the sign in disbelief. My house, the house I had built with my own hands, the house I had been forced to leave against my will, was being sold. without my knowledge, without my permission, without any consideration for my feelings or my legal rights. The rage that filled me was unlike anything I had ever experienced. It was a pure, white-hot fury that started in my chest and spread through my entire body like wildfire. They hadn't just evicted me from my home. They were now profiting from my exile, cashing in on the value I had created through years of hard work and sacrifice. I sat there for 20 minutes, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. Cars passed by, neighbors walked their dogs. Life continued around me while I processed this ultimate betrayal. My children weren't just ungrateful. They were thieves, stealing my life's work and selling it to strangers. But as the initial shock wore off, I began to think more clearly. How exactly were they planning to sell a house that wasn't legally theirs? Did they think I would simply sign over the deed without question? Did they assume that my absence from the property meant I had abandoned my rights to it? I pulled out my phone and called the real estate agent whose name was on the sign. A cheerful woman named Patricia answered on the second ring. "Hi, I'm calling about the house you have listed on Maple Street," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Oh, wonderful. It's a beautiful property. Are you interested in viewing it?" "Actually, I'm calling because I believe there might be some confusion about the ownership. I'm the legal owner of that house and I didn't authorize its sale." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "I'm sorry, sir, but I think there might be some misunderstanding. I'm working directly with the current residents, who provided me with all the necessary documentation of ownership." "What documentation?" I asked, my heart racing. "Well, I don't have the files in front of me right now, but I can assure you that we verified ownership before listing the property. Perhaps you should speak with them directly about any concerns." I hung up the phone, my hands shaking with a mixture of anger and adrenaline. What documentation could my children have provided? The house deed was in my name, had always been in my name, and would remain in my name until I decided otherwise. They couldn't sell what they didn't own no matter how long they had been living there. That evening I called Marcus. He answered on the fourth ring, his voice cautious. "Hi, Dad, how are you?" "I'm calling about the for sale sign in the front yard," I said, dispensing with pleasantries. "What the hell is going on?" "Oh, you saw that," he said, as if he had been hoping to keep it secret. "We were going to tell you." "Tell me what exactly?" "That you're selling my house without my permission?" "Dad, please don't make this dramatic. We talked to a lawyer and he said that since we've been living there and maintaining the property, we have certain rights. And since you moved out voluntarily—" "I didn't move out voluntarily," I shouted, my composure finally cracking. "You threw me out. You told me I wasn't welcome in my own home." "That's not how we remember it," Marcus said, his voice taking on the same cold tone he had used during our kitchen conversation. "You agreed that it would be better for everyone if you found your own place. We're not trying to hurt you, Dad. We're just trying to move forward. Move forward with my house, move forward with my life's work. You can't sell what isn't yours, Marcus. My name is on the deed and it's going to stay there until I decide otherwise. Look, Dad, we've invested a lot of money in improvements and upkeep. We've been paying the mortgage, the taxes, the insurance. We've earned some equity in this property." "Equity?" I laughed bitterly. "You want to talk about equity? I built that house from the ground up. I paid for it with 30 years of mortgage payments. I maintained it, improved it, and loved it long before you were old enough to hold a hammer. You've lived there rent-free for a few years, and now you think you own it? We're not trying to cut you out completely," Marcus said, his voice becoming more strained. "We're willing to give you a portion of the proceeds from the sale. It's not like we're trying to steal from you. A portion of the proceeds from the sale of my own house. How generous of you." The sarcasm dripped from my words like acid. "Let me make something very clear, son. That house is not for sale. It will not be sold. And if you continue with this ridiculous charade, you're going to find yourself in legal trouble that you can't talk your way out of. Dad, please be reasonable. You don't even live there anymore. What do you need with a 4-bedroom house? You could take your share of the money and buy something smaller, something more appropriate for your situation." "My situation?" I repeated. "You mean the situation where I'm living in a guest house because my own children evicted me from my home?" "That's not fair, Dad. We didn't evict you. We just suggested that maybe it was time for you to start a new chapter in your life." without consulting me about selling the house where I planned to live out that new chapter? The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, but it was clear that we were talking past each other. Marcus and his siblings had convinced themselves that they were entitled to sell my house, that their residence there had somehow transferred ownership to them, that my absence had voided my rights. It was a level of self-deception that would have been comical if it weren't so devastating. After I hung up, I sat in the small guest house and realized that I had reached a crossroads. I could accept their version of events, take whatever money they offered, and disappear quietly into the sunset. Or I could fight for what was rightfully mine, even if it meant going to war with my own children. The decision was easier than I had expected. I had spent months being passive, accepting their decisions about my life, allowing them to dictate the terms of my existence. But I was done being a victim. I was done being grateful for crumbs from the table I had built. The next morning, I called a lawyer. Attorney Henry Castellanos had been practicing real estate law for 23 years, and his office reflected both his experience and his success. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined the walls, filled with legal volumes and case precedents. A massive oak desk dominated the center of the room, and behind it sat a man who looked like he had spent decades dealing with exactly the kind of family drama that had brought me to his door. "Mr. Fernandez," he said, gesturing to the leather chair across from his desk. "Tell me about your situation." I had rehearsed this conversation in my head dozens of times, but sitting there in his office, I found myself struggling to find the right words. How do you explain that your own children have betrayed you so thoroughly? How do you convey the depth of injustice without sounding like a bitter old man? "My children are trying to sell my house," I said finally. "The house I built, the house I own, the house they forced me to leave 3 months ago." Henry leaned back in his chair, his expression neutral but attentive. "Let's start with the basics. Do you have the deed to the property?" "Yes, it's in my name. It's always been in my name." "And when you say they forced you to leave, what exactly do you mean?" I told him the whole story. The cold morning conversation, the months of increasing marginalization, the lawyer consultations my children had conducted without my knowledge. I described the "for sale" sign, the real estate agent's confusion, Marcus's assertion that they had legal rights to sell the property. Henry listened without interruption, occasionally taking notes on a yellow legal pad. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment, studying his notes. "Mr. Fernandez," he said finally, "I need to be direct with you. Your children have no legal right to sell your house. None whatsoever. The fact that they've been living there doesn't transfer ownership to them, and the fact that you moved out voluntarily doesn't void your property rights." But they said they consulted with a lawyer. If they did, they either lied to that lawyer about the ownership situation, or they found someone who doesn't understand property law. Either way, they're operating under a false assumption. "So what can I do?" Henry smiled for the first time since I had entered his office. Quite a bit, actually. "First, I'm going to contact the real estate agent and inform her that the property is being listed without the owner's consent. That should get it removed from the market immediately. Second, I'm going to send a cease and desist letter to your children, making it clear that any attempt to sell the property will result in legal action. And if they continue to fight it, then we take them to court. But I don't think it will come to that. Once they understand the legal reality of their situation, they'll likely want to negotiate." I felt a weight lifting from my shoulders for the first time in months. After so many weeks of feeling powerless, of being treated like a nuisance by my own children, I was finally taking action. I was finally fighting back. "There's one more thing," Henry said, his tone becoming more serious. "I think it would be beneficial to arrange a meeting with your children and their attorney. Let them hear directly from me what the legal situation is. Sometimes these family disputes can be resolved more amicably when everyone understands the facts." The idea of sitting across from my children in a legal setting filled me with dread, but I agreed. It was time for them to face the consequences of their actions. Time for them to understand that I was not the powerless old man they had assumed me to be. The meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday at 2 p.m. in Henry's conference room. I arrived 15 minutes early, my stomach churning with anxiety and anticipation. I had seen my children only briefly since moving out, and never in a context where I held any power or authority. They arrived together, looking like they were attending a funeral. Marcus wore a dark suit and carried a leather briefcase, trying to project an air of professional competence. Isabella had dressed conservatively in a navy blue dress, her usual artistic flair subdued for the occasion. Carlos, at 25, still looked like a college student in his ill-fitting sport coat and nervous expression. Their lawyer, David Sterling, was exactly what I had expected. A man in his 40s with perfectly styled hair, an expensive suit, and the kind of confident smile that suggested he had never met a problem he couldn't solve with the right combination of charm and legal maneuvering. Henry greeted everyone professionally and gestured for us to take seats around the polished conference table. I sat on one side with my attorney, while my children and their lawyer occupied the other side, as if we were adversaries preparing for battle rather than family members trying to resolve a dispute. "Thank you all for coming," Henry began, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had conducted thousands of similar meetings. "I think we can resolve this situation quickly and amicably, if everyone understands the legal facts." David Sterling leaned forward slightly, his smile never wavering. "Of course, Mr. Castellanos. My clients are eager to find a solution that works for everyone involved." "Excellent," Henry replied, opening a folder and removing several documents. "Let's start with the fundamental issue. Mr. Fernandez is the sole legal owner of the property located at 1247 Maple Street. He has been the owner since 1995, when he purchased the land and built the house with his own hands." "We understand that," David said, his tone suggesting this was common knowledge. "But there are other factors to consider. My clients have been living in the property for several years. They've made substantial improvements, and they've been responsible for all maintenance and financial obligations." "I'm afraid that's not legally relevant," Henry said calmly. "Adult children living with their parents doesn't create any ownership rights, regardless of how long they've been there or what contributions they've made. And the fact that Mr. Fernandez moved out voluntarily doesn't change his property rights in any way." I watched my children's faces as Henry spoke. Marcus maintained his poker face, but I could see the color draining from his cheeks. Isabella looked down at her hands, avoiding eye contact with everyone in the room. Carlos kept glancing at his lawyer, as if expecting him to produce some legal magic that would make this uncomfortable reality disappear. "Furthermore," Henry continued, "the property cannot be sold without Mr. Fernandez's consent. Any attempt to do so would constitute fraud and could result in criminal charges." "Now, wait just a minute," David said, his smooth demeanor cracking slightly. "That's a very serious accusation. My clients had no intention of committing fraud. They were operating under the assumption that they had legitimate rights to the property." "Based on what?" Henry asked, his voice sharp. "Did they have any legal documentation suggesting they owned the property? Did they have any contract or agreement with Mr. Fernandez transferring ownership to them?" David shuffled through his papers, clearly looking for something that wasn't there. "Well, no, but given the circumstances of Mr. Fernandez's departure and their ongoing residence—" "Mr. Sterling," Henry interrupted, "I've been practicing real estate law for over 20 years, and I can tell you definitively that none of the circumstances you've described creates any legal claim to the property. Your clients have no more right to sell that house than I do." The silence that followed was deafening. I looked at my children, searching their faces for any sign of acknowledgement, any recognition of the injustice they had attempted to perpetrate. But what I saw instead was anger, not remorse, not embarrassment, but fury that their plan had been thwarted. "So what happens now?" Marcus asked, his voice tight with barely controlled emotion. "That depends entirely on your family," Henry replied. "Mr. Fernandez has several options. He could demand that you vacate the property immediately, since you have no legal right to live there without his permission. He could sue for damages related to your unauthorized listing of the property. Or he could work with you to find a mutually acceptable solution." "What kind of solution?" Isabella asked, speaking for the first time since entering the room. Henry looked at me, and I nodded for him to continue. "Mr. Fernandez is willing to consider allowing you to remain in the property under certain conditions, but those conditions would need to be negotiated in good faith, with the understanding that he is the sole owner and has the right to make decisions about his property." "What conditions?" Carlos asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I leaned forward, and for the first time since entering the room, I spoke directly to my children. I want to come home. The words hung in the air like a challenge. My children looked at each other, then at their lawyer, then at the table, anywhere but at me. Dad, Marcus said finally, you know that's not practical. We've all established lives in the house. We've made it our home. It was my home first, I replied quietly. It was my home for 25 years before you decided I wasn't welcome there anymore. That's not fair, Isabella protested. We didn't kick you out. We just thought it would be better for everyone if you had your own space. Better for everyone or better for you? I asked. Because it certainly wasn't better for me. I've been living in a guest house for 3 months, watching you live in the house I built while you planned to sell it behind my back. David Sterling cleared his throat, trying to regain control of the conversation. Perhaps we could discuss some kind of financial arrangement. My clients have invested considerable money in the property. Stop, I said, my voice cutting through his calculated diplomacy. Just stop. I'm tired of hearing about their investments and their contributions. I built that house with my bare hands. I paid for it with 30 years of mortgage payments. I maintained it, I loved it, and I never gave anyone permission to sell it. Dad, please, Isabella said, tears beginning to form in her eyes. We never meant to hurt you. We were just trying to what? Get rid of me? Cash in on my life's work? Erase me from the place where I raised you? The tears that had been threatening finally spilled down Isabella's cheeks, but I felt no sympathy. These were the same children who had sat in my kitchen 3 months ago and told me I needed to leave, who had spent months planning to sell my house without my knowledge, who had treated me like an inconvenient obstacle to their happiness. Henry sensed the emotional temperature in the room and stepped in. Let's take a step back and focus on practical solutions. Mr. Fernandez, what specifically are you proposing? I had thought about this moment for weeks, imagining what I would say if I ever had the chance to reclaim my power in this situation. Now, sitting across from my children in a lawyer's office, the words came easily. I want my house back, I said simply. Not part of it, not a shared arrangement, not a compromise. I want to return to the home I built, and I want my children to find their own places to live. The silence was immediate and complete. Even the air conditioning seemed to stop humming. My children stared at me as if I had just announced my intention to burn the house down. Dad, you can't be serious, Marcus said, his professional composure finally cracking. We have nowhere else to go. Do you know how expensive rent is right now? Do you know how hard it is to find decent housing? About as hard as it was for me 3 months ago when you threw me out, I replied. But somehow I managed to figure it out. That's different, Carlos protested. You're older, you don't need as much space. We have careers, relationships, responsibilities. And I don't? I asked, my voice rising. I don't have a career. I don't have responsibilities. I don't deserve to live in the house I built because I'm older. David Sterling attempted another intervention. Mr. Fernandez, surely we can find a middle ground here. Perhaps a gradual transition, or a shared living arrangement with clearly defined spaces. No, I said firmly. No more compromises. No more shared arrangements. No more gradually giving up pieces of my life to accommodate their convenience. I've been compromising for years, and where did it get me? Living in a 300-square-foot guest house while they planned to sell my house. Henry nodded approvingly. Mr. Fernandez has the absolute legal right to make this demand. The property is his, and he can decide who lives there and under what conditions. But Dad, Isabella pleaded, this is so harsh. We're your children. Doesn't that mean anything to you? The question hit me like a physical blow. Of course it meant something to me. They were my children, my flesh and blood, the people I had loved more than life itself for over 30 years. But they were also the people who had systematically erased me from my own life, who had treated my feelings as irrelevant, who had tried to steal my home. You stopped acting like my children the morning you told me to leave, I said quietly. Children don't evict their parents. Children don't sell their father's house behind his back. Children don't consult lawyers about how to get rid of the man who raised them. We were trying to help you, Marcus insisted, but his voice lacked conviction. We thought you'd be happier living independently. Did you ask me if I'd be happier? Did you consider what I wanted? Or did you just decide what was best for me without bothering to include me in the conversation? Another uncomfortable silence settled over the room. I could see my children exchanging glances, having silent conversations about how to respond to this unexpected turn of events. They had come to this meeting expecting to negotiate terms for selling my house. Instead, they were facing the possibility of losing their home entirely. "How long?" Isabella asked finally, her voice barely audible. "How long what? How long do we have to move out?" I looked at Henry, who consulted his notes. Legally, since they're not tenants with a formal lease agreement, Mr. Fernandez could demand immediate vacating. However, given the family circumstances, a reasonable notice period might be appropriate. 30 days, I said. "You have 30 days to find other arrangements." 30 days? Carlos exclaimed. "Dad, that's impossible. We can't find apartments, get approved, save for deposits, and move out in 30 days. You should have thought about that before you tried to sell my house," I replied. "Besides, you've had 3 months to consider alternative living arrangements. You just assumed I would never fight back." David Sterling was furiously scribbling notes, probably calculating how much money his clients were about to lose and how much legal fees they were about to incur. "Mr. Fernandez, I have to advise you that this approach could damage your relationship with your children permanently." I laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "Damage our relationship?" "David, our relationship was damaged the moment they decided I was too inconvenient to live in my own home. Everything since then has just been me finally waking up to that reality." "Dad, please," Marcus said, and for the first time I heard genuine desperation in his voice. "We made mistakes, we handled this badly, but kicking us out isn't going to solve anything." "It's going to solve my housing problem," I replied, "and it's going to restore some justice to this situation." "What if we apologized?" Isabella asked. "What if we admitted we were wrong and promised to do better? What if you had apologized 3 months ago instead of consulting lawyers about how to get rid of me? What if you had treated me with respect instead of like a burden? What if you had asked what I wanted instead of telling me what was best for me?" The questions hung in the air unanswered because we all knew the answers. My children had not considered my feelings because my feelings had been irrelevant to them. They had not asked what I wanted because they had not cared what I wanted. They had treated me like a burden because that's what I had become to them. Henry looked at his watch and then at the assembled group. "I think we've covered the main issues today. Mr. Sterling, I'll send you a formal notice regarding the property listing and the 30-day vacating timeline. Mr. Fernandez, I'll prepare the necessary documentation to ensure your property rights are protected." "Wait," Marcus said urgently. "There has to be another way. Dad, what if we paid you rent? What if we signed a formal lease agreement? What if we gave you the master bedroom and we took the smaller rooms?" For a moment I was tempted. The idea of returning to my house while still maintaining some kind of relationship with my children was appealing. But then I remembered the months of humiliation, the cold morning when they had dismissed me from my own home, the for sale sign in my front yard. "Marcus," I said gently, "you had the chance to treat me fairly when you held all the power. You chose not to. Now I hold the power and I'm choosing to treat you exactly the way you treated me. That's revenge, not justice," David Sterling observed. "Maybe," I admitted, "but it's also the natural consequence of your client's actions. They wanted independence from their father. Now they're going to get it." We stood to leave, and for a moment I found myself face to face with my children in the conference room doorway. Isabella was still crying quietly. Carlos looked shell-shocked. Marcus appeared to be calculating his next move, still unable to accept that his plan had failed so completely. "Dad," Isabella said softly, "I love you. We all love you. Please don't let this destroy our family." I looked at her for a long moment, this daughter I had raised, whose scraped knees I had bandaged, whose heartbreaks I had soothed. "Isabella," I said finally, "you destroyed our family the day you decided I wasn't welcome in my own home. I'm just finally accepting that reality." As I walked out of the conference room, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Power. For the first time since this nightmare began, I was the one making decisions about my life. My children would have to live with the consequences of their actions, just as I had been living with the consequences of theirs. The drive back to Roberto's guest house felt different than it had in weeks. Instead of the crushing weight of defeat, I felt the lightness of possibility. In 30 days, I would be returning to my house, not as a tolerated guest or a burdensome relative, but as the rightful owner reclaiming what had always been his. That evening, I called Roberto to share the news. His reaction was immediate and enthusiastic. "Alfred, that's wonderful. I'm so proud of you for fighting back. Those kids needed to learn that actions have consequences. I just hope I'm doing the right thing," I said, though even as I spoke the words, I knew I was. "You built that house with your own hands," Roberto reminded me. "You earned the right to live there. Don't let anyone, not even your own children, take that away from you." That night, I slept better than I had in months. For the first time since leaving my house, I dreamed of returning to it, not as a supplicant begging for acceptance, but as a man reclaiming his rightful place in the world. The 30 days passed with agonizing slowness. I found myself marking each day on a calendar like a prisoner counting down to freedom, which in many ways, I was. The legal machinery that Henry had set in motion moved with bureaucratic efficiency. The "for sale" sign disappeared from my front yard within 48 hours, and David Sterling's increasingly desperate phone calls suggested that my children were beginning to understand the gravity of their situation. I drove past the house several times during those weeks, partly to monitor the situation and partly because I couldn't help myself. I watched as moving trucks appeared in the driveway, as boxes accumulated on the front porch, as my children began the process of extracting their lives from the home I had created. There was no satisfaction in their obvious distress, but there was a sense of justice finally being served. Roberto worried about me during this period. He would find me sitting in his backyard, staring into space, and he would gently ask if I was having second thoughts. "It's not too late to work out some kind of compromise," he said one evening as we shared a beer and watched the sunset. "They are still your children. They stopped being my children when they decided I was expendable," I replied, though the words felt heavier each time I spoke them. I spent 3 months being reasonable, being understanding, being the bigger person. Where did it get me? They tried to sell my house behind my back. But after they move out, then what? "You'll be living alone in a big house with 3 children who may never speak to you again." The question haunted me more than I cared to admit. Yes, I would have my house back, but at what cost? Was the satisfaction of justice worth the possibility of permanent estrangement from my children? Was being right worth being alone? But every time I wavered, I remembered the coldness in Marcus's voice when he told me I needed to leave. I remembered the months of feeling like a stranger in my own home. I remembered the "for sale" sign, and the realization that my children had been planning to erase me completely from the life I had built. 2 weeks into the 30-day period, Isabella called me. Her voice was small and defeated, nothing like the confident young woman who had helped evict me from my home. "Dad, I need to ask you something." "What is it? Do you really hate us? Have we hurt you so badly that you can never forgive us?" The question caught me off guard. I had been prepared for anger, for negotiation, for legal maneuvering. I had not been prepared for this raw vulnerability from the daughter who had once been my little princess. "I don't hate you, Isabella," I said honestly, "but I'm deeply disappointed in who you've become. We made mistakes, Dad. We know that now. But kicking us out isn't going to undo those mistakes. It's just going to create new pain for everyone." "The pain was already created," I replied. "I'm just redistributing it more fairly. What if we promised to change? What if we signed agreements about respecting your space and your decisions? What if we went to family counseling?" For a moment, I allowed myself to imagine it, returning to my house with my children still there, but with new rules, new respect, new understanding of boundaries. It was an appealing fantasy, but that's all it was. "Isabella, you had the opportunity to treat me with respect when I was powerless. You chose not to. Why should I trust you to treat me with respect now that I hold the power? Because we've learned our lesson. Because we understand now how much we hurt you. You understand because you're facing consequences, not because you've had some moral awakening. If I hadn't fought back, you would still be planning to sell my house and congratulating yourselves on how well you'd handled the situation." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, but it followed the same circular pattern. Isabella pleaded for mercy, and I explained why mercy was no longer an option. By the end, we were both crying, her from desperation, Me from the pain of having to be so hard with a child I still loved, despite everything. The final week was the most difficult. I found myself second-guessing every decision, wondering if I was being too harsh, too unforgiving, too focused on justice at the expense of family healing. But then I would remember the lawyer consultations they had conducted without my knowledge, the casual way they had dismissed my feelings, the assumption that I would simply accept whatever they decided was best for me. 3 days before the deadline, Marcus made one final attempt at negotiation. He arrived at Roberto's house without calling, looking haggard and desperate. "Dad, we need to talk." I invited him into the small guest house, and we sat across from each other in the cramped space where I had been living for the past 4 months. The irony was not lost on either of us. The successful businessman who had evicted his father was now sitting in the tiny room where that father had been forced to rebuild his life. "We can't find anywhere decent to live," he said without preamble. "Do you know what the rental market is like right now? Everything affordable is either dangerous or falling apart. Everything decent costs more than we can afford." "I imagine it's challenging," I replied. "Of course, I wouldn't know firsthand, since I had to move into a guest house when you decided I was inconvenient." "Dad, please. I'm trying to apologize. We were wrong. We handled everything badly. We should have talked to you. Should have considered your feelings. Should have found a way to make it work for everyone. Should have, but didn't. Because we were selfish and stupid and too focused on our own comfort to think about yours. I admit that. We all admit that, but Dad kicking us out isn't going to make anyone feel better. It's just going to hurt more people." I studied my eldest son, this man I had raised from infancy, and I saw genuine remorse in his eyes for the first time since this nightmare began. But I also saw calculation, the same strategic thinking that had led him to consult lawyers about getting rid of me. "Marcus, answer me honestly. If I had never fought back, if I had never hired a lawyer, if I had just quietly accepted your decision to sell the house, would you be here right now apologizing?" He was quiet for a long moment, clearly struggling with the question. Finally, he shook his head. "Probably not. We would have assumed you were okay with it." "Exactly. You're not sorry for what you did. You're sorry that it didn't work out the way you planned. That's not fair, Dad. We are sorry for hurting you. You're sorry that hurting me had consequences for you. There's a difference." The conversation lasted for over an hour, but like all the others, it ended without resolution. Marcus left looking defeated, and I was left alone with my thoughts and my doubts. On the final day, I packed my few belongings and prepared to return to the house I had built with my own hands. Roberto helped me load my car, and as we worked, he offered one last piece of advice. "Alfred, you're about to get what you wanted. Just make sure it's really what you need." I arrived at my former home, my current home, at exactly 6 p.m., 30 days to the minute after the deadline had been established. The house was empty, my children's cars were gone, and for the first time in 4 months, I was the sole occupant of the space I had created. I stood in the front yard for several minutes, looking at the house that had been the center of my universe for over 25 years. It looked exactly the same as when I had left, but everything felt different. The windows that had once glowed with the warmth of family life now seemed cold and dark. The front door that had welcomed countless guests and family gatherings now appeared forbidding. I unlocked the door with trembling hands and stepped inside. The house smelled different. Not bad, just different. Less lived in, more vacant. My children had taken their furniture, their pictures, their belongings, leaving behind the basic structure I had created, but none of the life they had filled it with. I walked through each room slowly, like a tourist visiting a museum of my own life. The kitchen where I had taught Isabella to make pancakes was spotless but empty. The living room where I had helped Carlos with his homework echoed with my footsteps. The bedrooms where I had tucked my children in each night for years were stripped bare, containing only the built-in features I had installed decades ago. In the master bedroom, my bedroom, I found a single envelope on the dresser. Inside was a handwritten note from Isabella. "Dad, we know you probably won't believe this, but we really are sorry for how we treated you. We were wrong to ask you to leave, wrong to try to sell the house, wrong to treat your feelings as unimportant. We hope someday you can forgive us. We love you, even if we didn't show it very well. Isabella, Marcus, and Carlos." I read the note 3 times, then folded it carefully and placed it in my wallet. It was too little, too late, but it was something. That first night back in my house was the loneliest of my life. I lay in my bed, in my room, in my house, and listened to the silence that surrounded me. There were no voices from other rooms, no footsteps on the stairs, no familiar sounds of family life. Just me and the echoes of everything I had lost in my quest to reclaim what was rightfully mine. I had won. I had my house back, my property rights restored, my dignity reclaimed. But as I stared at the ceiling in the darkness, I wondered if Roberto had been right. I had gotten what I wanted, but was it really what I needed? 6 months passed in my reclaimed house, and the silence never became comfortable. I established new routines. Coffee in the kitchen, where I no longer had to compete for counter space. Reading in the living room without anyone asking me to turn down the lamp. Working on projects in the basement without explaining what I was building or why. The freedom I had thought I wanted felt more like isolation with each passing day. I could paint any room any color I chose, but what was the point when no one would see it? I could watch whatever I wanted on television, but laugh tracks felt hollow when you were the only one listening. I could cook elaborate meals if I felt like it, but preparing dinner for one person seemed more depressing than liberating. My coworkers noticed the change in me. I had returned to work with renewed energy after reclaiming my house, but as the weeks passed, my enthusiasm waned. Jim, my boss, invited me to lunch one afternoon and gently probed about my situation. "You got your house back, right? That legal situation with your kids got resolved?" "Yes," I said, picking at my sandwich. "I won." "Then why do you look like someone who lost?" It was a question I had been asking myself daily. I had achieved everything I had set out to accomplish. I had proven that actions have consequences, that parents deserve respect, that property rights matter. So why did victory taste so bitter? "I'm fine," I told Jim, though we both knew it wasn't true. The house itself seemed to reflect my emotional state. Despite my efforts to maintain it, something felt wrong. Light bulbs burned out and stayed dark for weeks because changing them felt pointless. The garden I had once tended with pride became overgrown with weeds. Small repairs that I would have addressed immediately in the past were left undone, not because I couldn't fix them, but because I couldn't summon the energy to care. I tried to reconnect with old friends, but most of our relationships had been built around family activities and shared experiences with our children. Without that common ground, conversations felt forced and superficial. I joined a few community groups, but as the only member dealing with self-imposed estrangement from his children, I felt like an outsider even among outsiders. The worst moments came during holidays and family celebrations that I now spent alone. Christmas morning in a house that had once been filled with wrapping paper and laughter felt like a funeral for joy itself. My birthday passed unacknowledged, which shouldn't have surprised me but somehow still did. I found myself wondering what my children were doing, where they were living, whether they ever thought about the man who had taught them to ride bicycles and helped them with their homework. 8 months after reclaiming my house, I received an unexpected phone call. The voice on the other end was Isabella's, but she sounded older, more mature than I remembered. "Dad, it's Isabella. I hope it's okay that I'm calling." My heart raced. "Of course it's okay. How are you?" I'm getting married, Dad." The words hit me like a physical blow. My little girl, my princess, was getting married, and I had missed the entire courtship, the proposal, the planning. I knew nothing about the man she loved or the life she was building. "Congratulations," I managed to say. "When?" "In 6 weeks. Dad, I know things are complicated between us, but I want you to be there. I want you to walk me down the aisle." I closed my eyes, overwhelmed by the mixture of joy and pain that accompanied her words. My daughter wanted me at her wedding, wanted me to fulfill the traditional father's role despite everything that had happened between us. "I would be honored," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "There's something else," she continued. "Marcus and Carlos will be there too. We've all talked, and we want to try to rebuild our relationship with you. We know we hurt you terribly, and we know you have every right to stay angry with us, but Dad, we miss you. We miss being a family." For months I had imagined this moment, one of my children reaching out, acknowledging their mistakes, asking for reconciliation. But now that it was happening, I felt more confused than vindicated. "Isabella, I've spent 8 months learning to live without you. I've accepted that our family is broken. It doesn't have to stay broken, she said softly. Families can heal if everyone is willing to work at it. And what about the house? Are you going to ask me to sell it again? Are you going to want to move back in? No, Dad. We've all found our own places. We're not asking you to take care of us anymore. We just want to be your children again. The conversation lasted for over an hour, and by the end I had agreed not only to attend the wedding, but to host a small family dinner afterward at my house. Our house, the place where Isabella had grown up, and where she wanted to celebrate the beginning of her new life. The next 6 weeks were a whirlwind of preparation. I hired a cleaning service to address the neglect that had crept into my housekeeping. I repainted the dining room, planted new flowers in the garden, and even bought new furniture for the living room. For the first time in months, I cared about how my house looked because it was going to be filled with people I loved again. The wedding was beautiful. Isabella looked radiant in her white dress, and her husband David seemed like a genuinely good man who clearly adored her. When I walked her down the aisle and placed her hand in his, I felt a mixture of pride and heartbreak that only fathers of daughters can understand. Marcus and Carlos were polite but cautious in their interactions with me. We exchanged pleasantries, shared a few memories, but avoided discussing the events that had driven us apart. It was a careful dance of reconnection, with everyone aware that one wrong step could shatter the fragile peace we were trying to build. After the reception, the family gathered at my house for the dinner I had promised. It felt surreal to have my children back in the space they had once called home, but now as guests rather than residents. They admired the improvements I had made, complimented the meal I had prepared, and carefully avoided mentioning the months of silence that had preceded this reunion. As the evening wound down and my children prepared to leave, Marcus approached me privately. Dad, I need to say something. What we did to you was unforgivable. We were selfish and cruel, and we treated you like you didn't matter. I know saying sorry doesn't undo the damage, but I am truly, deeply sorry. I looked at my eldest son, this man who had once been my best friend and fishing companion, and I saw genuine remorse in his eyes. Not the calculated contrition of someone facing consequences, but the raw pain of someone who had finally understood the magnitude of his mistakes. I appreciate you saying that, I replied. But Marcus, trust is like a vase that's been shattered. You can glue the pieces back together, but it's never quite the same. I know, he said, but maybe it can be something different. Maybe it can be stronger in some places because of where it broke. Over the following months, we began the slow process of rebuilding our relationship. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't always comfortable. There were moments of tension when old resentments surfaced, times when someone said the wrong thing or pushed too hard too fast. But gradually, we found a new equilibrium. My children visited regularly, but they came as guests now, not residents. They asked permission before making changes, respected my decisions about my property, and treated me with the consideration they should have shown from the beginning. The house was undeniably mine, but it was once again filled with family love. A year after Isabella's wedding, as I sat in my living room surrounded by my children and their partners, I reflected on the journey that had brought us to this point. I had lost my family and fought to reclaim my house. In the process, I had discovered that a house without family is just a building, but that family without respect is just biology. The deed to my house still bore my name, and it always would. But more importantly, my children had learned to respect the man whose name was on that deed. They had learned that love without respect is hollow, and that taking someone for granted is the fastest way to lose them. We were a family again, but we were a different kind of family. We were bound not just by blood and history, but by the hard-won understanding that relationships require effort, respect, and constant tending. We had all paid a price for that understanding. Me through months of loneliness, them through the loss of their comfortable assumptions about unconditional parental acceptance. As I looked around the room at my children laughing and talking, I realized that Roberto had been both wrong and right. I had gotten what I wanted, my house back and my dignity restored. But more importantly, I had eventually gotten what I needed. A family that valued me not just as a provider or caretaker, but as a person worthy of respect and consideration. The house was still mine, The name on the deed hadn't changed, but now that name carried the weight of lessons learned, bridges rebuilt, and love that had been tested and found strong enough to survive even the worst mistakes, because the papers said what they had tried to erase. This house has an owner, and the owner is me. But more than that, this house has a family. And despite everything we had put each other through, that family was still us.